Today we look at one of the most 40k of devices. We have looked previously at the world-ending Quake cannon, literally a titanic scale round fueled by the power of Exterminatus. We've seen the Emperor's Sword and the Harlequin's Kiss, and then of course the Vortex grenades, sadly now absent from more current iterations. But one of the most horrifying creations of humanity across its dark and disturbing timeline, amid so many other horrifying and truly insane devices, is that of the Butcher's Nails. Now, I am certain that many know of this creation already for obvious reasons, it's so well known, yet it remains also one of those things that seems to be always heard of, but without the real understanding behind just what it actually is. Commonly, when I hear mention of the Butcher's Nails, there's always someone who doesn't know, but maybe have heard its name in reference to, of course, Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters, or maybe in relation to that fabled 12th Legion. As I said, unsurprisingly, throughout the history of humanity, there are various weapons, tools, and technology designed for pain amplification. Some Space Marine chapters, even in M41, use pain amplification as a way to test and initiate new members through their period of trials, the Imperial Fist's Pain Glove for example. But this disturbing practice of humanity inflicting pain creatively is of course nothing new. Look back to the ancient history of humanity with its extreme practices such as the breaking wheel, endless horrors involving cutting, crushing, burning, and all manner of inhuman degradation. Sadly, human history is littered with such examples, far too many to go into today. So it should be no surprise that planets cut off from all other human civilization during the Age of Strife, ravaged first by their own societal collapse and cannibalization, followed by varying degrees of destructive warp incursions, would lead many human worlds to collapse into backward states of disgusting forms of amusement, and it's very likely something which continues on into M41 across human planets of the Imperium, albeit very much likely less in plain sight. This would be the case especially upon the world to which the 12th Primarch would find himself, crawling out from his amniotic pod upon the world of Nuceria, a cursed, brutal planet which was ruled over by an unseen nobility referred to as the High Riders. This ruling aristocracy constructed complex gladiatorial games of the cruelest practices imaginable. The 12th was captured almost as soon as he arrived on the world, and before he could even speak, thrown into the arenas, forced to murder innocent fellow slaves as they battled for their very lives amid rising tides of toxic acid, so powerful it boiled away any who fell or were thrown in as they fought for the diminishing real estate of a pyramid they had been placed upon. The boy with no name was victorious that day and would be named Angron. And this first battle was especially intriguing, primarily because of the fact that the thoughts narrated to us via a World Eater's psycho who had been bonded to Angron's memory in an attempt to subdue him enable us to understand that Angron's first instinct was not to kill, that he felt a great desire to not inflict harm upon the innocents. Meanwhile, as the Emperor traversed the galaxy as part of his Great Crusade, the slow rediscovery of the Primarchs are thus placed to lead their legions. For most of the legions, this is a joyous event full of celebration and unity. For the 12th Legion, it quickly becomes complicated. For unlike other Primarchs whose specific personal traits allowed them to excel upon the worlds they found themselves scattered to, it's difficult to know just what Angron had the potential to be. He is of course unrelenting, unbreakable, but so are the other Primarchs, and by the time he leaves Nuceria, he is damaged almost beyond repair and recognition. Angron's life upon Nuceria is almost entirely one of cruelty and suffering, not only for himself but in witnessing countless untold horrors. As the aristocracy above watch the foul gladiatorial entertainment through floating cameras, the masses and nobility are both betting on the most trivial and most terminal of outcomes. Angron quickly becomes a champion and defeats any and all that are thrown against him, but in his confinement bonds with his fellow captives forced to fight. His bitterness grows, and upon one fateful day he defeats multiple champion gladiators, monstrous figures who were themselves seemingly implanted with the Butcher's Nails, known to all on Nuceria. Angron, having slaughtered not one but two implanted with this device, is a sight never seen before by the crowds of Nuceria. In Angron's story, he had also been aided by one of the fellow pit fighters almost from his arrival, and so on this day, when the High Riders of Nuceria tell Angron that they must now fight to the death, his stunning refusal sets him on a course that will change not only his destiny, but that of the entire 12th Legion. As Angron is reunited as part of the Crusade, basically against his will, the Legion inevitably becomes reflective of its Primarch. Intentionally or not, for those formerly known as the Warhounds and now the World Eaters, they face a challenging and extremely unforgiving transition process. Similarly, Angron finds himself torn from a world born to him through agony, suffering and unrelenting violence, ripped from his greatest moments of vengeance by an emperor he knows nothing of, forced to abandon his lifelong family of slave fighters, placed in command of a legion he appears to care so little for, he's content to execute them on the slightest pretext. In fact, Angron's apathy toward his legion is so extreme, many of the Astartes within the 12th Legion are considering rebelling against him even before they have turned traitor. Angron carries forward disturbingly much of the cruelty and pressures from the gladiatorial life he had been forced to lead, which is to a degree understandable given it's all he has ever known, and so the 12th are now also to be forged in his image and mentality. There is of course a tragic poetry in the fact that Angron is shaped as an individual by one of the most extreme crucibles of human cruelty, but that those twisted humans he calls the High Riders unleash Angron and the World Eaters subsequently upon the galaxy. It's a matter of subjectivity as to whether Angron's return to the 12th allows them to reach their full potential or fundamentally breaks their powerful traits of pragmatism and a logical sense of strength through planned unbreakable domination that had previously made them so successful. But after one especially humiliating and stinging defeat, a sequence of events occurs that ensures they will not be able to turn back. The nails have been hanging over the 12th since Angron's return, but few thought his threats to implant them across the entire Legion should ever really happen. The so-called butcher's nails are of course a lower terminology for the device, which is in fact known as a cruciumen. The implant does not generate or force artificial rage upon those that it is implanted upon. Instead, it prevents regulation of emotion and only allows its bearer to feel pleasure through the sensation of anger, rage, violence. All other emotions are suppressed so as to be almost undetectable, or to instill a sense of pain and agony. The most disturbing aspect of the cruciumen is that this does not only apply to feeling but to every action. For anyone grafted with the butcher's nail, even thoughts and breathing are enough to cause continual pain. And the only way to alleviate this is by acting out thoughts and feelings of aggression, rage, violence. The Emperor of course did at one point attempt to examine, remove and repair the nails from Angron, but unfortunately while the technology existed to remove the device from the brain of the 12th Primarch, even the Emperor was incapable of doing so. The reason being, his brain had been so fundamentally damaged either prior to or during its implantation, as he had been clearly surgically operated on. Some sections of his brain are commented on as having been removed prior even to the insertion of the cruciumen, which by the time he was reunited with the Legion is embedded so deeply into Angron's brain that it wraps down his cortex and spinal column. Removal of it would mean his brain could not operate fully and would condemn him to a certain death. There is though a significant difference between the butcher's nails implanted into the 12th Primarch and those that were developed among the World Eaters by Angron's orders, that they should all be similarly implanted with the cruciumen as he had been, to make them more effective warriors, to make them more brutal and furious, unrelenting, to allow them to become undefeatable and truly live up to the name of their legion. The nails of the Astartes though were poor imitations. They merely scrape the nerves to a state of raw pain, alleviated by the rush and fury of unrelenting violence, thus soothing the pain to them. But Angron's nails were altogether different. The device surgically hammered into his skull was fundamentally more damaging for him, not just emotionally but in its twisting of his consciousness. How it steadily and permanently was destroying his cognitive functions, robbing him of any opportunity for peace, calm, or to enter any normal state of rest for his mind. Regardless though, Angron had come to the conclusion and enacted the mandate that the 12th Legion should develop their own butcher's nails to implant all of his sons, that they might share in the furious, raging benefits of them for war. Medicae, thralls and tech adepts worked tirelessly alongside Astartes apothecaries and techmarines to study and develop their own functioning, stable replication of the butcher's nails. It was far from a clinical or pragmatic study. The research laboratories of the World Eaters were more like abattoirs of a mad scientist, even the walls themselves scrawled with calculations and theoretical speculations, stacks of medical data sheets with thick red lines marked across them for the endless failures they had endured. At least though, and often because of Angron himself, they had a near continual supply of dead Astartes to experiment upon. Skulls sawn open to expose their brains, row after row, ready to be tested and assessed for any potential step forward. It was only when the World Eaters arrived upon the world of Genna was the discovery made that would change the 12th Legion forever and finally allow them to develop a stable, functioning version of the Butcher's Nails, to be mass implanted within the warriors of Angron. Like so many technological steps forward for the Imperium, this relied on their assessment of Archaeotech and STC designs. Again, there always appears to be a bit of a question mark and grey area over just how research and analysis occurs within the Imperium. In purely theoretical terms, such practices are considered tech heresy, yet it also seems to actually occur with considerable regularity at a small scale anyway. I think it really tends to be a case of just what you can get away with before anybody notices. And what tends to be key is that Archaeotech, when encountered, may attempt to be understood, but rarely what we might consider to be brand new ideas spring from it. You might be able to examine something and find how it works so that you can then perhaps just move adjacent to it a little, but you couldn't take, say, a component design, break it apart and start constructing all new devices. It's also important to remember that during the period of the Great Crusade there was a different outlook toward technology, at least from the Emperor's point of view, even if it were not strictly shared by the Mechanicum, who consider all technology to already exist as created by the Omnissiah. The human population of Genna had endured the Age of Strife, as did so many human societies, and seemingly at one point it had been a fairly advanced society. However, they had suffered severely with genetic diseases, and in order for their society to continue to function, it appears that their STC had designed a solution for the barely 1,000 Gennas who now remained. They would be essentially entombed within stasis life pods. These not only acted to preserve them, but allowed each Gennan to connect their mind with thousands of slave artificial humanoid forms, simulacrum. Bizarrely, the world shifted from being one of humans to creating a society of billions of puppeted synthetic beings who espoused a seemingly peaceful ideological view. Upon the arrival of the crusading 12th Legion, the beings of Genna proposed a very reasonable solution, as did so many worlds during the Crusade. They wanted to merely live peacefully. They explained they respected that the Imperials had their way to do things and that they had their own. The two could live in peace, respecting each other equally, and that they would be of no concern or bother whatsoever. And after all, their world was irrelevant and worthless to something so large as the Imperium. Unfortunately, during the discussions, the World Eaters momentarily detected that the emissary sent to speak with them was not human, and thus they were instantly slaughtered, along with all who accompanied the Gennan emissary. What should have been an easy victory, though, of unarmed civilians turned into one of the greatest failures of any Space Marine Legion, as the millions of Gennan simulacrum were able to overwhelm some of the most veteran and powerful World Eaters through sheer weight of numbers, their bodies crushing and pulping the Astartes by just their physical mass. However, this chain of events led to Angron becoming so enraged that he had to be constrained by the Astartes' psychers, thus enabling the Tech Marines and Apothecaries to not only inspect Angron up close and have access to the aforementioned dead World Eaters, but also to the artificial beings of Genna, thus enabling a discovery of the source of the Gennan command and thereby making a connection to the neurological technology, enabling the 12th Legion finally the successful installation of their replica Butcher's Nails for the Legion. Of course, though, thereby damning the entire Legion to an eternal cursed existence of pain and rage and unrelenting violence which would exist way beyond the heresy. Except, it may not have been that way. One of the Centurions of the 12th Terran born, and not dissimilarly to so many of the original Astartes such as Nathaniel Garrow, they took a less than favourable view of the plans their Primarch had to shape their Legion. And while some such as Khan, who saw nothing but awe in the power and unrelenting fury of Angron, welcomed the prospect of the Butcher's Nails, Others felt that this was a disgusting travesty, and that instead of empowering and enabling the Legion to reach its full potential, the prospect of all World Eaters being forcibly grafted with the Butcher's nails was a line that must not be crossed. Crossed though it would be, and the World Eaters under Angron himself were able to launch a devastating counterattack upon Genna. The World Eaters would fight their way to the central command installation of the Gennans, who were distorted, bloated and feeble figures, ravaged by cancerous bodies, and were surely not long for whatever was left of their existence. They pleaded to be simply left alone by the Imperials. Of course, all were slaughtered, and even the apothecaries and tech marines only gained limited insight from the amazing array of technology on display in the ancient command centres by order of Angron. All was of course to be destroyed. The rebellion within the 12th against Angron's plans of course obviously failed, and the plans for the implantation of the Butcher's nails for the Legion began as fast as they could be produced and connected. The World Eaters now to be condemned into a life of pain and brutality beyond anything any could have ever imagined. Even more so of course by the end of the Horus Heresy. Angron and the Butcher's Nails is a tragedy among a galaxy of human tragedies. Most of all, it is a tragedy that highlights a seemingly endless constant in human history for mankind's appetite to inflict inhumanity upon itself. The High Riders Angron learned to fear and then to hate turn out of course to be little more than weak, shriveled, decadent, worthless, especially cruel humans whose ruling authority has become so extreme in its stagnation from what must have been at one point a technologically advanced human planet, but now has descended to the lowest depths of depravity, a backwater world of an ignorant enslaved peasantry whose only outlet for relief is through witnessing and gambling upon bloodthirsty pit fighting, a world with no moral or ethical code, and a culture among its citizenry and aristocracy which undoubtedly fueled other vices. Nuceria was a cesspit of the very worst and most crude human desires, focused around the suffering and dehumanization of others. One can only imagine the perversity which existed beyond the boundaries of Angron's memory in the wider society. Unfortunately for Nuceria, their depravity and lack of moral courage in these dark times would come around to bite them so many years after Angron was torn from the world by the Emperor. At this time, the world had already been pacified by the Imperium, and those false rulers who had enacted such cruelty during the days of Angron's rebellion, long dead. When though the 12th Primarch returned, accompanied by Loregear, he was now a very different Angron than when he had left Nuceria. He discovered that despite everything, somehow, the last vestiges of the aristocratic nobility of the High Riders had clung to power. But the real trigger for Angron's rage becoming unquenchable comes as he discovered through the words of a senior, well-respected officer that upon his homeworld since his absence, the legend of Angron and his rebelling family of pit fighters had not been exactly distorted, but from Angron's perspective, inaccurately documented, so that upon Nuceria, he, Angron, was known as having abandoned the closest thing he had to a family that fought and bled and suffered alongside him, and that finally, as they were surrounded by the combined forces summoned by the powerful rulers of Nuceria at that time, the Emperor stole Angron away, ripped him from the world in their most dire moment of need, thus condemning his family to a death unspecified, but certainly a slaughter. And surely one could speculate for some there far worse a death than a battlefield. Angron's rage was entirely uncontrollable, becoming so consumed at these revelations, he crushed the officer's head in his fist as if it were a ripe piece of fruit, without being even aware that he'd done so. He'd break another as if they were nothing but a paper doll. Even Khan cannot contain or console the Primarch, and his vengeance is to be unleashed upon the world. This would be the end of Nuceria. Perhaps if they'd learned from their past, toppled their leaders and moved forward, it could have been very different. But humans are never especially good at learning from their past. Change, after all, is painful, but not nearly as painful as the vengeance Angron would reap as he ordered the wholesale extermination of all human life upon Nuceria. Although it would not be the last chapter for the damned world. With its history of inhuman misery, it would also see later Angron during battles with the Ultramarines and the Wordbearers alongside ascend finally to his state of demonic power, and Nuceria became a demon world, but not for long, as in the final days of the heresy, the Dark Angels would silence it forever. The shock of this rippling throughout the warp even reached Angron as he battled on Terra and shared this vision with the 9th Legion's Primarch, a very ambiguous vision but later confirmed that New Syria has been reduced at last to a dead world. The real horror of the Butcher's Nails, for me anyway, is not so much the literal device, nor the impact they have upon those with them hammered into their skull. The Butcher's Nails, the cruciumen, represent multiple far more depressing facts about the nature and history of humanity. Who can say why the nails were originally developed? It's difficult to see exactly why they would have been created during the Dark Age of technology, which was meant to be a more enlightened period. But evidently they do originate from this time period. Perhaps they were a last-ditch effort upon specifically the world of New Syria by an STC attempting to help its human population survive against the onslaught of the Men of Iron. Perhaps they only survived at all by installing these upon the warriors who had to face down beings who cared not if they lived or died, and only by mentally implanting of these devices were they able to overcome the enemy. On the other hand, we know that the nails suppress other emotions, and that the pain they cause can only be alleviated through violence. But even knowing that, is there a possibility we could consider that the cruciumen could have at one point been some kind of healing tool, perhaps developed by an STC to aid damaged colonists, or maybe as even a humane way of controlling those who were predisposed to violent actions? It would seem plausible and fitting that a device that began this way, but that during the fall of humanity and the subsequent isolation during the Age of Strife, it could be that technomancers upon New Syria would seek to then distort and twist the original purposes of a cruciumen to something used for more perverse actions than were originally intended, like for example gladiatorial pit fighting. I'm basically thinking out loud here, but it seems reasonable enough to me. Small tangent here that you probably didn't expect in this video, The Butcher's Nails actually makes me recall the story titled The Terminal Man by Michael Crichton. Before I talk about that, I might say some spoilers here, which I rarely do for 40k because I consider there to be no spoilers in 40k, it's just a giant jigsaw puzzle of information. But The Terminal Man, it's a pretty good story. I would say not one of Crichton's most popular, as it hasn't really been made into a super successful movie, but it was very well regarded at the time when released. But I do recommend it. It's probably on Audible as well, I might give it a listen. Anyway, in that story, following an accident, the main character begins to have seizures followed by blackouts, awakening with no knowledge of what he has done. During these seizures, he commits violent assaults on others and is selected for an experimental new procedure of what they refer to as a brain pacemaker, essentially designed to cause electric stimulation to suppress these seizures. However, other doctors predict that this is very dangerous and that the patient is in fact psychotic. They do not believe that it's going to prevent the crimes he commits during these blackouts. Even the team performing the operation is not totally convinced that it will work, but they feel confident it will be beneficial enough to proceed. So 40 electrodes are implanted into the subject's brain, controlled by a small computer connected to a power pack in his shoulder. One of the surgeons refuses a man who puts himself forward for this same procedure, but so that the electrodes will be put into the brain for no reason other than to stimulate pleasure. But in doing this assessment, the doctor realizes that should somebody do so, they could potentially become addicted, and that includes the possibility of the subject that they have just done the procedure for in preventing these seizures. After the surgery recovery, they begin to activate the electrodes implanted in his brain, and they subsequently discover that the seizures are becoming now more frequent, and that the subject is in fact learning to initiate seizures voluntarily because the result of these seizures is a shock of pleasure, which leads to him having more frequent seizures and blackouts. Then they discover he's escaped the hospital. Without going on to the rest of the story, it obviously gets problematic from there. And another small adjacent would be of course the very appreciated episode from Deep Space Nine titled The Wire, where we see that Garak, a Cardassian aboard the station, excuse me for not giving his entire backstory, was implanted with a device designed to allow its wearer to withstand torture by relieving discomfort and pain through a release of endorphins. The conditions on the station so alien and miserable for Garak that he begins to use the device to allow his days to pass with a little bit more comfort. But over time he begins to use it so much that he just leaves it on permanently, ending in him eventually having massive seizures. Of course, a lot more to the story there as well. So my point being though, there are many plausible options as to why the cruciumen, the Butcher's Nails, could have originally been created. These kind of ideas are explored more in fiction generally, but the truly bleak and depressing factor when it comes to the technology is that as humanity turned inward and upon itself during the Age of Strife, much of the technology that had once made humanity so powerful that enabled it to achieve its status as a zenith civilization during the Golden Age would now enable it to reach the very depths of depravity, so that when the planets of humanity fell, they fell hard. Some so hard they were destroyed, others merely fell into the pits of depravity, in the case of New Syria, quite literally. It remains a continuing, not so subtle theme for the 40k verse that it is all too often not the terrifying Xenos nor the nightmarish technology such as the Butcher's Nails that is the real horror. For the real enemy of humanity is of course itself, displayed to us in how easily things become twisted and abused and sadistically forced upon innocence by the degenerate humans who are the tattered remnants of a once glorious galactic civilization. You would imagine that something like the Cruciaman may be bad enough, for how things like the nails were utilised upon New Syria. Unforgivable. But of course the story doesn't end there, and soon Angron, and moreover through the actions of the Emperor, if we really want to drill down on root causes, we end up in the truly horrifying situation of the World Eaters being implanted with the nails, and the whole composition comes together. Angron will ascend to demonhood, the World Eaters corrupted forever, twisted beyond repair, and the disgusting planet of horrors New Syria is burned to a dead world. Glory to the Emperor and the Imperium of mankind. Or maybe not.